We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis. I'm Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. Well, as I record, there are only 3 days to go until the election. As we've talked about many times on the show, the result is probably already decided. We just have to wait to find out what it is. Meanwhile, the campaigns continue. In an interview with Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump once again incited violence, this time against Kamala Harris supporter and Republican Liz Cheney. Both Trump and Harris are campaigning in the Rust Belt, so both of them have been in Michigan and Wisconsin today, Friday, US time. But over the weekend, they are both heading to North Carolina. So I am standing in the car park outside the PNC Pavilion here in Charlotte in North Carolina, watching a very long line of cars leaving the rally for Kamala Harris that finished just a little while ago. So I thought, while I wait quite a while for my ride, I'd tell you a little bit about the experience. They are, of course, really high security, so you have to spend quite a bit of time going through security checks, ID checks. You can't take anything in, no bags, no liquids, almost nothing. So people only really have their phones with them. It was a huge crowd, so there was quite a long wait. The pavilion holds 18,000 people, and by the end of the rally, I think it was pretty close to full. There was a long line of celebrities who preceded Harris, including actor Kerry Washington and even John Bon Jovi, which was surprisingly not lame. And then Harris herself came out just as the sun was kind of peeking in through the roof of the open-air pavilion. And she got a huge reaction. The crowd absolutely loved her. She is, unsurprisingly, charming in person, exudes a really warm energy, was laughing and smiling and wasn't even derailed really by some protesters in the audience who somehow, I'm not sure how they did it, got a banner in and faced a really quite hostile reaction, not from Kamala Harris at all, who responded by saying democracy can be complicated and this is what democracy looks like and, it's all good. But the crowd itself was really quite hostile. There were some people kind of pointing and shouting who were really visibly angry at this protest. So the protesters were removed eventually and Harris pivoted kind of weirdly, to be honest, to talking about small business and got a lot of cheers for that. So that was really quite jarring. But then she pulled the crowd back, and after a couple of minutes, everybody seemed to relax again and lean into those joyful vibes. And the crowd was loving it, and it was quite an experience to hear the crowd reacting with such fervour and joy to a policy about price gouging and some very specific policies about carers and Medicare, and then to hear that described as significant change. She had this particular line about Gen Z and how much she loves Gen Z and how they're impatient for change. The implication being that she's going to give it to them, that Harris will give them change, which doesn't really line up with the policies, I suppose, that she's offering. They are changes, but they're not structural changes. So overall, it was quite an experience, and really the thing that stood out to me the most was just how many women were in the crowd. Men were outnumbered by a huge amount. I try and estimate, but it was just extraordinary just how many women were in the crowd, how many young black women were in the crowd, and how many older white women as well who, could have been Elizabeth Warren's sister. It was quite the experience, and an unusual experience, I think, in politics to have a crowd so dominated by women. So the conclusion I draw from that, which is not at all an original one, is that if Harris wins, it will be off the back of women's turnout, of suburban white women's turnout, but more importantly, black women's turnout and young black women's turnout in particular. So those are my takeaways on this absolutely stunningly beautiful evening in Charlotte in North Carolina. We're really lucky today to hear from a North Carolina local. R. Bruce Thompson II is partner, government and public policy group leader at Parker Poe, and he's based in Raleigh in North Carolina. He is in fact a top North Carolina political influencer and one of the state's most influential lobbyists. In 2016, Bruce served on the National Finance Committee for the Hillary Clinton for President campaign, and he was an advisor to the Clinton campaign during the North Carolina primary. In the 2008 general election, he also advised the North Carolina campaign of President Barack Obama. Before joining Parker Poe, Bruce was an assistant attorney general in the North Carolina Department of Justice. Bruce and I spoke about how important this election is to the United States and the rest of the world, how that is playing out locally in North Carolina, and also what a Harris administration might look like. Here's Bruce now. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I wanted to start, Bruce, because the election is being characterised in the United States and all over the world as the most important election in generations or in living memory, however you want to frame it. Is that how you see it?
We say that in the United States every 4 years. I mean, it really is a refrain of, this is the most important election. And yeah, I think the next one always is the most important. But this one's a little unique for a couple of reasons. First, it's just a huge election year in the world. I've read some studies that over 60% of the world's population has or is going to have a national election this year. So there's going to be a lot of shakeup around the globe, and I think where the U.S. fits in that is something that's important. But also in terms of just the U.S. electorate, I mean, it becomes more and more divided, and I think that people involved in politics on both sides of the aisle, frankly, are ready to enter a post-Trump era of U.S. politics. And it just depends on whether or not that post-Trump era begins next week or if we're looking at another 4 years of his presidency. So yeah, I do think this is the most important one I've ever experienced in my life, for sure.
Bruce, you said that, if Trump wins, we're looking at another 4 years, but there are legitimate and very significant concerns about Donald Trump's threat to democracy, his threat to the institutions of American democracy. How serious do you think that threat is?
They're very serious. I mean, just last night, Trump's response to someone who is opposed to him is not to debate them, it's really to threaten them. And his latest threat is one he put out last night against former Representative Liz Cheney. And, his handlers are trying to explain their way out of it. But I find it fascinating that there was a complete meltdown in the American press this week because of a bad choice of words by President Biden. And I'm not seeing the same response this morning from the American press over the Trump suggestion that, Liz Cheney should face 9 barrels directly aimed at her. So you have to take it seriously, and you have to hope that the protections that the founders of our country put in place will hold. I mean, they held last time Trump was president. He put a lot of pressure on them. And will they withstand a second Trump presidency? Well, there are a couple of things, sort of I'll argue both sides of it. The biggest concern I have is, when Trump was president before, the people that he surrounded himself with were the adults in the room, especially as some of his cabinet officials. But almost to a person, they have endorsed Harris. They're not going to be around for a second Trump term, and I feel like the people that try to get rid of any obstacle for Trump, they're going to be the ones calling the shots, both within the White House and at the agencies. There are a number of things that Trump wants to do right out of the gate that are going to require the cooperation of the Attorney General of the United States. And so he is looking for an Attorney General that is not going to uphold the rule of law, but is just going to uphold whatever he wants to do. So that's why we should be frightened. On the other side of the argument is I think no matter what happens in the presidential election, that Democrats are going to take back control of the U.S. House. I think Republicans will control the Senate. So at least for the first 2 years, you have one chamber of the Congress that is not going to roll over and do what Trump wants them to do. That's going to be a great check on his power. And then the other thing that goes with that is the midterm election in 26. The Senate map favors Democrats to take back control of the Senate. And in a Trump midterm, I think it's too early to predict 2 years out. But I think there are very good chances that Democrats would expand their majority in the House. And so for years 3 and 4 of a potential Trump presidency, you would have Democratic control of Congress and they could keep him in check. So the system has all of these checks and balances in place. They would be tested again in a second Trump presidency.
Yeah, they sure would. And in your mention of congressional elections, you kind of pointing out, I suppose, that all politics is local. You are in North Carolina, which is one of the 7 battleground states, or what we assume will be one of the 7 battleground states in the election, one where margins, just like everywhere else, are razor thin. How are you seeing the campaign in North Carolina?
Well, anyone who thinks it would be fun to live in one of the swing states hasn't experienced a presidential election. I mean, the attention on one hand is nice. I mean, you really can't go 24 hours without one of the principals coming and campaigning here. Both Harris and Trump were in North Carolina 2 days ago. Harris is coming back on Saturday. Waltz has been here. J.D. Vance has been here. There's no shortage of rallies. The thing that's driving everyone nuts are the constant ads on television and on your social media and radio and everything else. You really can't go anywhere without being exposed to it. So, we're seeing a ton of negative ads on both sides. It's not pleasant. Unfortunately, it works in politics, and that's why people continue to run negative ads. But there's this balance of excitement and annoyance when you live in a swing state. And it's hard to tell what's going to happen. I mean, the polls are really all over the place. We've seen an influx of Republican polls in the last probably week to 10 days. And I think some of that is driven by, there are a lot of sites in the U.S. like 538 and Real Clear Politics that just aggregate a lot of polls. And it's changed the averages. I mean, I'll give you an example. Most of the polls in North Carolina have had it as a toss-up, maybe 1 point either way. But this group, Atlas Intel, came in with a poll showing Trump up 4. Fox News did a poll that was very similar. And they're outliers, but they change the averages. And so it changes these aggregate sites from Trump or Harris being a +1 or a toss-up to now showing Trump as a leader. And I don't know, to be honest, where it comes out. I think it all depends on the turnout. Republicans in North Carolina are turning out better for early voting than they did 4 years ago. But there's a caveat to that. 4 years ago, Trump instructed them not to early vote. And this time he said, I want you to early vote. And the thing about early voting is it gives both sides an opportunity to see what part of the electorate has turned out. At the beginning of early voting, African American voting was very down in North Carolina, which was a real red flag to Democratic candidates. But they've corrected that. They've been able to go in and these campaigns are so sophisticated. They know who the voters are that they have to turn out, and their ability to track whether or not someone has voted and go get them out to the polls, give them a ride, give them a reminder, or whatever it may be. It's interesting to watch that, because before we had early voting in the U.S. and we just voted on election day, there's no way to tell until the election was over. But now when you have a several week process, you're able to look at a snapshot on a daily basis and know where you're doing a good job or a bad job in turnout. So that's a very long answer to say, I don't know what's going to happen in North Carolina. I don't know what's going to happen in any of these 7 swing states. I've looked at different scenarios where I could see either Trump or Harris running the table on all 7 and winning this in, pretty much a landslide if one of them does that. But again, I don't think there's any way to predict. I think the people that are making predictions are trying to make themselves feel better about who they want to win, to be honest, because I don't think that anybody who's involved in American politics can look at what we have and make any definitive case. You can make a case for different outcomes, but if someone has a good read on where we really are, then every candidate needs to hire that person, because they're indeed a soothsayer who can see the future.
I think you're right that person doesn't exist. I've had previous guests on this show who describe predicting it as more of a psychological test, which I think is exactly how you're describing it there. Bruce, if the polls are right and it is as close as we think it is, part of what could happen is that something similar that happened last time around. So you were talking about early voting there and the different demographics, the different kinds of voters who use different kinds of voting, I suppose, be it early or in person. Last time around, the Trump administration or the Trump campaign used that phenomenon when it was what's often described as a red mirage or a blue shift. So when a certain kind of voting, in-person voting, for example, which is counted first, favours one candidate, but then that shifts because of different sets of voter counts. How worried are you about a similar scenario playing out again this time around in North Carolina or elsewhere? Or are you confident that the lessons of that experience have been learned and that the institutions of American democracy are better prepared for that kind of scenario?
I am confident in our election system and in the people who run the election system. I'm not confident in people trying to challenge the system and already setting it up. I mean, you've really seen that from the Trump campaign. He's already claiming in a speech last night, he said that they've already found election fraud in Pennsylvania. The only thing that tells me is that Trump saw a poll and his numbers don't look good in Pennsylvania, and that he's setting himself up for that. And I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, frankly, that's what we're seeing in some of this polling that has been impacting the averages. I think in some ways, I mean, let's say that Harris wins all 7 of those states and she wins the presidential election in a landslide. The Trump supporters, based on what they did 4 years ago and 8 years ago, are going to cry foul and say, well, the poll showed us winning. They stole votes from us. And they look at this. I mean, the interesting thing is, unlike the system that you're used to, where there's mandatory voting and you can get a good idea, you could really put together a poll, I think, that would give you a good indication about, what the outcome of the election would be. Here, we have no idea who is going to vote. I mean, there can be vociferous supporters of either candidate who, for some reason, just don't vote. And there are a lot of people that sit it out. And and you have to model for that. And I think that, people don't take that into consideration. The other thing they never take into consideration is counting votes is not like an athletic contest where one team jumps out to a lead and you have to do something to pull it back. I mean, the outcome has been determined when the polls close. We just haven't counted the votes yet. So there's technically no back and forth. But one of the things we saw 4 years ago with Trump is in a state where he was leading and maybe they had not counted some urban votes. When they counted those urban votes, he started claiming that it was fraud because I was winning by 20,000 votes and they added 20,000 Democratic votes. So obviously somebody's cheating. Well, no, they just counted different batches. I really wish we had a system that counted all the votes and they didn't report it until it was 100%. But we tend to show things as they go. And you see, for instance, in North Carolina, if they count the votes in Raleigh and Charlotte before the rest of the state, it's going to look like Harris is running away with it. But if they flip it and count the rural votes first, then Trump's going to be there. But all that matters is what the total vote is. So I have seen Trump and the folks who represent him, using that as some sort of proof that there was fraud. But, I think they've shown us that they will, here's a guy who didn't concede last time around, and it's just not in his MO to concede. And, people love to criticize Hillary Clinton for casting some doubt on Russian interference in the 2016 election. But the thing they forget is that even though she wasn't happy about it, she conceded the next day. She gave a speech and conceded to Trump. Trump never conceded, and he won't concede after this election, no matter the result. So, we're going to be setting ourselves up for litigation. The thing we can hope is that the court system does what it did 4 years ago. They tossed every single one of Trump's legal challenges. Trump also, is not occupying the White House. So he comes at this. His challenges come from a little different perspective. And if Democrats win the House in the election, that House will be sworn in on January 3rd. So when the electoral college votes are brought in and certified on January the 6th, there's a good chance you could have a Democratic House that is looking at that, which would be very different than what we dealt with last time.
2024 is not 2020. I think it's always really important to remember that.
And we're not going to be caught off guard like we were before. What happened in 2020, I don't know of many Americans who could ever imagined that would happen. But we go into it with our eyes wide open this time, and I think we're all diligent about protecting the Constitution and protecting the system.
I think that's absolutely true because Americans, you and the rest of us, I think outside in the rest of the world, know who Trump is and have a fairly clear idea of what he will do after the election and what a second Trump administration might look like if that comes to pass. I think, though, that that's less true of a Harris administration, not because, as much of the media has been saying, we don't know her policies or anything like that, just because she hasn't been president before, she hasn't built an administration before, we don't know exactly what it will look like. But I think you're better placed than most people to predict, if you want to, what a Harris administration might look like, and especially how it might conduct foreign policy. So I was wondering if you could, I know it's speculation, but maybe you could explain to an Australian audience what a Harris administration might actually look like.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And I think one area that will have a huge impact on Australia and the relations between our countries is looking at who she may place as a Secretary of State. And one of the interesting names, and I guess I should preface this by saying there's this question of, is a Harris administration just the same as a second Biden administration? And I think there are going to be some key differences. One of which is the fact that Harris has said she wants to appoint a Republican as a cabinet official. And she also has been talking a lot lately about what you do with your political enemies. And her refrain has been, I want to give them a seat at the table. So I think she has a real opportunity. And in the Secretary of State slot, one of the people they have talked about is former U.S. Senator Jeff Flake, who's a Republican from Arizona and who has supported her in this election. And I guess I bring that up to say the Secretary of State spot, the people that she's looking at are political moderates, or even in Flake's case, a conservative. But I think she wants to make sure she has a Secretary of State that is independent minded, has experience with foreign policy. That's why Jeff Blake's been mentioned. There's another U.S. Senator, Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who's been mentioned. I think she wants to have someone who will go out there and try to solidify our place in the world. I mean, I think as Americans, we're on a little shaky ground there right now, just with everything that's gone on in politics here in the last decade. And I think she wants to bring a little more stability towards those relationships, and have those relationships focused on the cooperation between the countries, as opposed to favoring nations that you might be friends with their head of state, or they're aligned with you politically. I mean, Trump comes in, and obviously you worry about relationships with Russia. I saw Mr. Orban was tweeting last night that he was, had just talked to his friend Donald Trump and was hoping for a great last 5 days. I mean, that doesn't portend well for any of us on the international stage. And I think we've got to get it back to not being about personalities, but being about the people in the countries, being about the businesses that do work together, talking about how we collectively defend against threats in the world, and really shoring up those relationships, I think, will be a real key out of the gate for Harris, because she's obviously, as vice president, done a lot of international travel, but her work has not been focused on the world stage. And so I think it's important for her to surround herself with people who have that good experience, and for her to get out there and signal to the world that, America's here, America's stable, America is your friend, and we're going to work well together.
And that's such a clear explanation, I think, of why this election matters so much, not just to the United States, but to the rest of the world as well.
I just hope we can, whatever happens, move past it. And, for me, people who are not Trump supporters have the gallows humor of, well, we need to find somewhere else to live if he's going to be president again. But we can't take that approach as Americans. We have to do the best with what we have. We have a system that's in place that doesn't always result in your choice winning, and you have to respect all these things I'm saying about the system. If Trump wins, I have to respect that and accept it and make the best of it that I can, and continue to be an advocate for those things that I believe in, even if my choice is not in the White House. So I think it's really important not to feel like the world is going to end based on either one of these people being in the White House, that the system and the world and the people in that system and the world are better than that, and we can withstand whatever comes to us. So the day after the election, no matter who wins, I've got to get to work, and we all have to get to work, and we'll know then who we're working with, and we'll make the best of it.
I think that's a really lovely thing to add. Thank you. And it's, so important to remember when it's easy to fall into cynicism. So on that note, Bruce, thank you so much for your time, in which I know you are so critically busy. We just appreciate it so much.
Well, I appreciate your interest in it, and I hope we can take some of the mystery out of the theater that is American politics, and focus on getting good people elected, and making sure that we have everything in place to continue our good relationships that we have with Australia and her people. And I just can't thank you enough for your interest.
The pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thank you.
This episode was recorded on Friday the 1st of November US time, and no doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed by the time you hear it. If you're enjoying After America, please help us spread the word by telling your friends about the show. You can find us on social media. We are at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and on Instagram. And you can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.